Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. It's my great pleasure to welcome you at this seminar of the Department of Epidemiology. This is a special seminar of the Department of Epidemiology of the Harvard School of Public Health because it is jointly with the Maternal and Child Health concentration of the Harvard Chance School. And this concentration is led by Dr. Henning Thiemeyer, whom you will hear in a minute. But it's my pleasure to now first introduce, really very briefly, Dr. Bill Copeland, who will give the seminar today, The Grand Challenge of Child Mental Health, Lessons from the Great Smoky Mountain Study. And Dr. Copeland will be further introduced by Dr. Henning Thiemeyer. Henning, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Bert, for this introduction of the introduction. And
Yeah.
It is my pleasure to introduce Bill Copeland. No, I'm introducing, I can honestly say, a hero of mine, a friend, a collaborator, and one of the leading psychiatric epidemiologists in children in the US and worldwide. He studied clinical psychology in Vermont, then moved to Duke and got involved in the Great Smoky Mountain and many other studies and published very, very seminal work on poverty, on bullying, on infectious. And I just will say one anecdote and then I'll give it to Bill, how I got to know him. I always was a fan of the work of Adrian Angold and Jane Costello. And then one day I realized, why is there always this one first author who writes all the paper? And I discovered it was Bill Copeland. And then I realized there is somebody behind the work of these people. Bill, having said that, the floor is yours. Thank you for taking us up on the MCH EPI seminar in 2026.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you for that generous introduction, Henning. I appreciate that. So now I'm going to do the most difficult part of my talk. I'm going to try to share my screen successfully. And so if this works, maybe this whole thing will go okay. Let me know. Can folks see this okay?
Yes, I think this is good. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, again, thanks for having me. I've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to kind of jump right into it. But I want to talk a little bit about child mental health and why I feel like there is a grand challenge there. And I'm going to use some data from the Great Smoky Mountain study, also some data from some other studies as well to kind of get there. So first off, I just want to kind of throw out my disclosures. I've received grant support from a number of NIH institutes and the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. And then I received some funding from the nonprofit Research Center for Children, Youth, and Families. Okay. And so my objectives today are going to be to talk a little bit about the public health burden of child mental health disorders, which is something I'm guessing a lot of you are already acquainted with. And then to also talk about the level of unmet need that we have with child mental health problems, the number of children that have problems that are not necessarily getting help for those problems, and then some of the consequences of that unmet need, both within childhood and across the lifespan. Okay. So this is a figure with some data from the GBD, the Global Burden of Disease Studies, that looks at the kind of distribution of the impact of different diseases across the lifespan. So you can see in these figures, they kind of have 5-year increments and they start at the bottom with 5 to 9 years old and go to the top all the way up to 90 to 94 years old. And the thing that I want you to pick up on here is that mental disorders are unlike any of the other categories. So if you're looking at cancers, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, all of these things have an onset later in life, and that's where they have their impact upon functioning. Mental health disorders, which is there in red, have an early onset. They're very common, and so they have the potential to impact functioning across the rest of the lifespan. And this is something I want to keep in mind as we kind of go through this. And indeed, when we look at the kind of public health burden of diseases within this early life period in the first 2 decades of life, the primary contributors to this are mental and substance disorders, and then suicidality and unintentional injuries. So the things that I'm going to be talking about today. Okay. So this is a little bit about my structure of my talk. I'm going to introduce you to a study. I'm then going to talk about what it's taught us about child mental health and service use, and maybe even get to this kind of grand challenge idea. But I've got a long way to go in the next 25 or 30 minutes. Okay. So the Great Smoky Mountain study has been around for quite a long time, longer than I have been a part of it. This is a community representative study in 11 counties in western North Carolina. And this began back in 1993. So the study is now 33 years old. And it includes 1,400 participants who are originally ages 9, 11, and 13 back in 1993. And about a quarter of the sample is made up of participants from the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, which is located there in Western North Carolina. These children have been followed up longitudinally multiple times within childhood, through adolescence, young adulthood at 19 and 21, and then in adulthood at ages 25, 30, late 30s. And we just have completed an assessment in the early 40s focused on aging at this point. So we've been following them for a long time. This shouldn't be a surprise to many folks. This is a map of North Carolina, and the study has always been run and operated out of Duke University, which you can see right there in the triangle in the middle of the state. The counties from which the Smoky sample comes from is in the far western part of North Carolina that borders Tennessee and South Carolina. And also right along that state border, you have the Great Smoky Mountain National Park from which the study got its name. And not surprisingly, this is kind of a beautiful mountainous area, as you would expect. The reason why it was chosen for this study is because there hadn't been psychiatric epidemiologic work done in rural areas in the United States. Most of it had been limited to urban areas close to universities. And so this was kind of in contrast to that, a rural area, small towns, high levels of child poverty. So the sample kind of by its kind of very ascertainment area is kind of an at-risk sample. And then, as I mentioned, it's also home to the Qualla boundary, which is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Okay. And it's also part of what we call Appalachia. This is kind of a map of Appalachia. It's part of Southeast Appalachia. This area has gotten a lot of attention in the last decade or two because it's been one of the epicenters, really, of kind of the opioid overdose crisis. And that's something that's affected Smoky participants as well. And this just kind of shows you a little bit the history of the study. In the upper corner there, you have Jane Costello and Adrian Engold, who started this study in 1993, well before I was involved in it. I think I might have been in middle school at the time. And then on the bottom there, you can see that table with the three cohorts who were ages 9, 11, and 13 back in 1993. If you followed across, those are ages. And all of the cells that are lit up in blue are ages at which participants have been assessed. Okay. So if you were part of that youngest cohort in 1993, age 9, you might have been assessed, 14 times, over this 33-year period. So it's a lot of assessments over a limited period of time. And you can also see it's never been a study that was just funded to kind of, continue to be funded. It had to every 5 years re-justify itself to NIH. So originally it was funded by NIMH with a goal around psychiatric epidemiology. Later on, it was funded by NIDA because of their interest in the onset and persistence of substance use patterns in the late teens and early 20s. Then later on, it was funded by NICHD as an intergenerational study of risk and resilience. And amazingly, we've kind of now come to the point where it's funded by NIA as a study of rural aging. So we're kind of running out of institutes at this point, but we've used a number of them over the years. And these are just some of the participants who are willing to kind of make their photographs available to you, so you could see this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the assessment, but it's always been kind of based on this bedrock of the structured diagnostic assessment of mental health problems. And so this is the child and adolescent psychiatric assessment interview that you see there on the side, which was developed by Adrian Engold and colleagues and is meant to be a really in-depth assessment of psychiatric status. And this was completed with the child about themselves with the parent about the child, and has really kind of been that kind of core assessment for the study since the beginning, although things have changed over time. As you can see over there on the right, we also collect a lot of other additional information too. There's information about the parents of our participants. We collect biomeasures. We collect dry blood spots every time we go and see these participants. I've got freezers and freezers of unassayed blood spots if you have some great ideas for those. And then we also have added administrative records, educational, criminal, juvenile justice, census tract data, all of that kind of stuff as well. So this is just kind of giving you an overview of this study and to give you a sense that with all of these longitudinal studies, they start out being about one thing. In this case, it was interview-based study of psychiatric epidemiology. And over the course of 33 years, they become about a lot of different things. Most of those things completely unanticipated at the time the study began. And if we're fortunate, we hope that, it will be able to continue. Maybe not for another 30 years, but, at least for the rest of my career. So that was part background. It was part publicity. For any of those of you that are interested in research questions that are related to mental health and are related to kind of lifespan functioning, Smoky is a great data set to kind of avail yourself of. And I'm more than interested to talk to folks about different opportunities for you to kind of jump into this data and to ask all the questions that I haven't, and Jane hasn't, and Adrian hasn't, and others as well. Now I want to move into talking about what we've learned about the epidemiology of child mental health and service use from Smoky over the course of the last 30 plus years. And I think talking to a group like this, you're all very knowledgeable when it comes to child mental health. And so I want to kind of provide some of kind of the basics here. And I found it useful to frame this as a quiz. It's always helpful to have people pre-register what their expectations for these things before I kind of provide some of the answers. Because if I just provide the answers and everyone says that they knew it all along, okay? So the first question here is, what percentage of children at any given point in time have a mental illness? Is it 4 to 8%? Is it 8 to 12? Is it 12 to 17? Or is it 17 to 23? I don't know if folks are allowed to speak up about this or not. But is anyone willing to wager a estimate on this?
Can I just ask, what is the age range when you talk about children?
Yeah, here let's just say middle childhood and early adolescence. Okay.
Seda, what is your guess here?
12 to 17.
Okay, bingo. Way to be bold there. So we now have a recent study that has kind of looked at this worldwide, and I think the prevalence that they came up with was 13.4%. So about 1 out of 6, 1 out of 7 children at any given time kind of meet criteria for a well-specified psychiatric disorder. And this is data from Smoky. And you can see in our little kind of a Pac-Man figure here that it's 13.2% in Smoky. So almost exactly what we were reporting there in terms of the worldwide prevalence. And this is a 3-month prevalence for kind of psychiatric disorders. Of that 13%, about half of them, a little bit more than half, have 1 disorder. Then there's a smaller group with 2 disorders, and there's 2.9% that have 3 or more disorders. If we were to include children that also had significant impairment related to psychiatric symptoms, but did not meet formal criteria for a disorder, we would add another large slice of the pie, another 16%. That would be the subclinical or the subthreshold group that has psychiatric problems, okay? But we're dealing with kind of a group of different things, okay? I really enjoy the concept of the p-factor. I think it's been really useful. But we're talking about heterogeneous sorts of conditions here. And so, and each of them has a very different developmental trajectory as well. So first we see here in red anxiety disorders, which start out common early in middle childhood with separation anxiety, becomes a little bit less common in adolescence, and then goes on an upswing as the kids transition into adulthood with panic disorder and agoraphobia kind of leading the way. Depression's different. This one has a low prevalence early in childhood, and that increases into adolescence, particularly for females, which continues across maturity for females as well. That stays relatively stable there. And then we have disruptive behavior disorders in black there. This is the most common pattern that we see within childhood and adolescence. It looks like these kind of disappear as folks move into adulthood. That is not in all the case, but our taxonomy is largely driven by clinical services and kids getting into clinical services. And kids get into clinical services because their parents and their teachers are annoyed at their behavior or have problems with their behavior and want to get them help. Once kids move into adulthood, then we get into self-referral. And there aren't as many folks that are self-referring for throwing tantrums or for being inattentive or for some of these disruptive behavior problems. They're still there, but they kind of disappear from our taxonomy because of these referral trends, okay? And then I want to add in the substance disorders, which has a different trajectory than any of these other things. This is alcohol, which you can see is almost vanishingly rare there in childhood, rises steeply in adolescence and into adulthood, and then it descends very steeply into the middle 20s as well. We see a very similar line in yellow there for cannabis-related disorders as well. We've studied this quite a bit, but the primary game in town when you're talking about this transition to adulthood is substance disorders. I will opine it's a little different for nicotine, and it's very different from opioid disorders, at least in our data. But these are the common disorders that we deal with. So when we look across childhood, we see there's a large group of kids that have met criteria for a psychiatric disorder by the time they're kind of leaving childhood. There's another large group of kids that had some sort of impairment but never quite met criteria. And then we have another large group that never were diagnosed or impaired. And this is kind of what I like to call the paradox of mental health problems in children. At any given point in time, it's relatively uncommon that a given child will have a psychiatric disorder. We saw our 13%. But if we look over time, it becomes very common that a given child will have in their history, cumulatively, will have had a mental health problem. So you can see by age 16, we're at about 40%, and it gets up above 60% by age 25 for the well-specified disorders. This is looking cumulatively. This is not looking at any point in time. And then we add on top of that those that are sub-threshold, it actually bumps the number up to over 80% of children by the time they reach 25 have experienced some sort of disruptive psychiatric problem in their life, okay? So what looks rare at any given point in time is actually relatively common when we look across the full range of childhood. And very few people get to adulthood without having had some sort of mental health or psychiatric problems. This has been shown in other studies as well at this point, okay? So a lot of kids are affected. What percentage of kids with a mental health disorder get help, get services for their condition? Is it 70%? Is it 60%? Is it 50%? Or is it 40%? Anyone want to jump in on this one?
I can make a second guess of 40%.
Okay, very good, very good. You are 2 for 2. If you get one more of these, then you'll get, Carl Castle's voice on your voicemail. Sorry, that's from an NPR show. It's a low percentage. It's more likely that they will not get help than that they will get help. This is from work from Barbara Burns and then also Kathleen Marikangis in the National Comorbidity Adolescent Supplement. Okay, most kids with a diagnosed disorder in the community don't get help. If you're just looking at clinical samples, you're missing over half of the population. If you're thinking about an iceberg, you're just kind of focused on that top that's above the water and you're missing everything below. This is some data from smoking, where we see in childhood, the rate is actually a little bit higher in terms of the service utilization, conditional service utilization rate. It's 50%. That's because We're assessing services in so many different domains, including this informal domain of services, where you're not necessarily getting services from a mental health professional, but maybe it's from a spiritual or religious advisor, maybe it's from a mentoring program or something like this. But the most common place that kids get services is not in our outpatient clinics. It's not in our medical offices. It's in the school setting, okay? And when they're getting treatment in the school setting, the goal is not always complete remission of symptoms. It's about finding a way to maintain the child within school so that they can kind of do what they need to do within school and they can learn and complete their assignments. So this is not necessarily the treatment that we would consider the gold standard. We see it's about 19% that are getting treatment in that specialty mental health or psychiatric services that we would really consider the gold standard. So the vast majority of these kids are not getting the best services. And even those that are getting services within specialty mental health services may not be getting what we consider the best, most efficacious, empirically supported treatments. And if you think this is bad, when we get to young adulthood, it all drops in half. So any ideas as to why that would be? Well, here again, we have this referral issue, okay? The reason why kids are getting in is because the teacher is telling mom and dad that your child needs a little help, or the child or the parent is saying, I think Jimmy or Jane really needs to get in there. Once we get to young adulthood, the child often needs to refer themselves, and this is less likely to happen. And so even though the rates of disorders don't go down, the likelihood of getting services goes down dramatically, and a lot of kids fall through the cracks during this young adult period in particular. And this is just some of the conditional service use rates that kind of demonstrate this. But I'm going to move right along, okay? So then the question is, there's a large number of kids that are affected by these. There's a small number of kids that are actually getting the services that we want them to. What happens to youth with mental health problems as they transition into adulthood? Does this leave a mark that stays with them across the lifespan? Okay, so let's get back to our quiz here. What percentage of children with mental illness have a disorder as an adult? Is it 40%? Is it 50%? Is it 60%? Or is it 70%? Okay, no one seems willing to jump in. I once settled a bet between two members of the NIH intramural program that was directly related to this question, with one of the folks saying that it was like 80%, okay, which obviously isn't the case because I don't have that as an option. And the other
So
researcher saying,
there's guesses in the chat. So
oh,
people are active in the chat. I might.
okay, they're good. Okay, good. I can't see that right now, so I'm guessing that you're all getting this right. But the answer is 50%. Okay, so it's about a coin flip for kids that have a disorder, whether they'll continue to have a disorder in adulthood. A lot of folks that work with kids in a clinical setting believe that this is much higher. But this just goes to show how difficult it is to kind of predict what that trajectory is going to be the kid for that child going into adulthood, and how poor we often do kind of prognostically in this regard. So here is some data from Smoky, where actually the rate is a little bit higher at this point. It's closer to 60%. You can see some variability depending upon the childhood disorder that you had, whether it was behavioral. The highest, level of prediction is for depressive disorders. And then you can even see that those kids that had just impairment only are at some increased risk over that group that had no disorder or impairment, who still have who still have some risk for having a disorder for the first time in adulthood, okay? But there is much more to functioning in adulthood than just whether a person meets criteria for a psychiatric disorder. And so we wanted to look beyond that and to say, okay, well, across multiple areas of functioning, how are these kids doing in terms of their physical health, in terms of their criminal behavior, in terms of their educational, financial functioning, and in terms of their social functioning? So we created scales in each of these domains, and you can see the scales, and you can see a few indicators that are part of those scales. There's many more indicators than what what's included here. And now we're going to look at, the same groups, kids without a disorder in childhood, kids with just impairment only, and then kids with a full-blown disorder, and see how they kind of stratify on these scales that are really trying to get at real-world functioning in adulthood. And this is really one of the most interesting figures I think I've ever produced in my career, because this is actually real data. But if I tried to make up data, it couldn't be more striking than the way that this turned out. So let's just start over there on the left with physical health, this scale. We can see that those non-cases, the folks that never met criteria for a disorder, are functioning at the highest level, okay? And actually, they're functioning at the highest level regardless of which of these domains we're talking about, okay? So they seem to be kind of advantaged, not only in terms of psychiatric functioning, but in terms of all these other areas. The green group is this kind of subclinical only group. And when we kind of standardize these scores, they're kind of right along that midline, okay, in terms of their risk. And then those folks that had met criteria for a well-specified psychiatric disorder in red, this is the group that's struggling the most in young adulthood in these different domains. And actually, when we kind of split out that red group, based upon the number of disorders that they had met criteria for in childhood, whether it was just one disorder, just two disorders, or three or more disorders, we can see this stepwise, almost kind of dose-dependent association between their number of disorders in childhood and their kind of risk within each of these categories, very different categories within adulthood. Okay, so this is something that's kind of staying with them and affecting multiple areas of functioning. We then wanted to look at a limited set of kind of outcomes that we would kind of say are evidence that someone is really struggling to make a successful transition from childhood to adulthood. Multiple mental health problems, suicidality, incarceration, dropping out of high school, okay? What is the risk for these types of outcomes based upon child psychiatric status? And you can see this same sort of kind of association that we saw with some of the other outcomes. For those that had a disorder in childhood, they have like a 50-50 chance of having one of these critical outcomes, whereas those that were in the non-cases, it's closer to 20%. And you can see that when we're talking about two or more of these key outcomes, it's vanishingly rare in this non-case group, but then much more common in the subclinical and in the case group, okay? So not only affecting psychiatric functioning, not only affecting real world functioning, but also affecting these real critical outcomes that we're looking at too. And again, this tracks with the dose of kind of psychiatric problems that they had in childhood, with that group with the most disorders at the highest risk for these problems later on, okay? And this is just kind of following up on that, kind of reiterating some of those findings. I'm not going to belabor this, okay? But what I want to get to next is what I consider the most kind of important, the most critical outcome we can possibly look at, and that is mortality, okay? So we followed these kids now for 33 years. And so we have now kind of submitted their information to the National Death Index to get information about mortality. What percentage of our sample has died? They're now in their early 40s. And we can see 96% of our sample, we believe, is still alive. 4% have died at this point. It's actually kind of challenging to figure out whether that's high or low. It seems to be a little high based upon our understanding of it. But then if we look at the specific causes, because we're talking early in the lifespan here, they're only in their early 40s, while the largest group is illnesses, the second largest group, and very close to the largest group, is overdoses. And this is primarily opioid-related overdoses, which are kind of rampant in this part of Western North Carolina. This data went through 2023. We know of at least a handful of additional participants that have died of opioid overdoses since then. You can also see the number of suicide-related, alcohol-related, car accidents, homicide, accidental injuries, and so on and so forth, okay? So what we then wanted to do, oh, I've gone ahead too many, is we wanted to say, okay, well, we were collecting all of this information about their mental health status during childhood. How telling and how predictive is that early information that we collected about conduct disorder symptoms? These are symptoms of things like aggressive behavior and delinquency, and depressive symptoms of all-cause mortality by the early 40s, okay? So this is prospective symptoms predicting kind of early mortality. And of course, we adjusted for sex, for parental education, and for race ethnicity. What we see for all-cause mortality is there is a significant prediction from conduct disorder symptoms to all-cause mortality by the early 40s, okay? But not necessarily for major depressive disorder symptoms. So then we wanted to follow up on this and look at specific types of all-cause mortality that seem to be more related to kind of choices that individuals make than are necessarily kind of related to things that happen to you, like illnesses. And this is kind of a cluster of kind of deaths that have been called the deaths of despair. This is overdoses. This is suicide-related deaths. This is kind of alcohol, cirrhosis, liver disease. And what we see when we look at this smaller group of mortality causes is that we still see a significant prediction from conduct disorder symptoms, but we also see significant prediction from major depressive disorder symptoms as well. So both of these independently are predicting death, related to overdoses and suicidality, which is the majority of these cases within the smoky sample. We're looking at this in some other samples as well. One of them is the Ad Health sample, which is large and nationally representative, similar age that we're dealing with. And the hazard ratios are extraordinarily similar to what you see here, both conduct disorder symptoms and major depressive disorder symptoms predicting these so-called deaths of despair. So we're seeing the kind of far-ranging and really kind of significant consequences here of kind of childhood mental health problems. So, so the question is, okay, this is all very dire, but we do know that some kids get services. And the question is, do services that kids receive within childhood for their mental health problems help? Is treatment in childhood prevention for adult problems? Does this kind of help you to avoid problems kind of later on in life? And so we want to kind of leverage an embedded natural experiment within Smoky to answer this question of, do services help? Okay. And as I mentioned, this is a treatment as prevention hypothesis. And so to do this, what we want to do is to use propensity score methods to look at this. So within the sample, as you know, we have a large group of kids that have met criteria for psychiatric problems. And we have some of those kids that have gotten services, specialty mental health services. And then we have a large group that have not gotten the specialty mental health services. And so we want to compare those that both have psychiatric problems. One got services and one didn't get services. Problem is, we all know that there's a lot that's different between kids that get services and kids that don't get services. And so in order to do this comparison, we first want to kind of adjust for those factors, which might predict one's likelihood of getting mental health services to begin with. And to do that, we're going to use propensity score methods. And we're going to try to achieve a covariate balance for variables like sex, for race, ethnicity, for insurance status, very important in terms of services, for low SES, for family instability, for maltreatment, for childhood emotional symptoms, behavioral symptoms, incapacities, trauma. Basically, we threw into this propensity model, as you do, everything in the kitchen sink that we could kind of find that could possibly explain why one group would get into services and one group would not get into services. And we were able to get inverse probability of treatment weights from that, which kind of were able to effectively balance all of these covariates that we were interested in, and to kind of set up this kind of mock experiment within our sample of kids with disorders that did or did not get kids with disorders that did not get services. Okay. So this is the first set of results here. And we're looking at kids that had any disorder and their risk for different types of adult disorders. Any disorder on the left, emotional disorders in the middle, and substance disorders on the right. Now, your orange bar are those that just had a disorder, no services, okay? Your blue bar on the left are those that had disorder and also got specialty mental health services. And what we were hoping to see is that that blue line would be lower than the red line, that those services would provide an advantage in terms of your likelihood of having an adult disorder. But that's not what we saw. You can see here that the blue line for kind of having any adult disorder is actually slightly higher than the orange line. And if we go over on the right here to the substance disorder category, that blue line is significantly higher than the red line. So what this is suggesting is that those youth that had a disorder and got services are at increased risk for adult substance disorders over their peers that had a disorder but did not get services. Okay, so not only is this not what we expected to find, but this is perhaps the most depressing finding I've had in any analysis that I've kind of ever run. And, you know, I do think that there's a logic to how this could work out, okay? A child is struggling with some sort of problem within childhood. They get in to get services, okay? And often it's not the child's choice, of course, to get into the services. It's their parent that's bringing them into the services. And they receive these services, and let's say they don't find them very helpful. And honestly, there is not a lot of evidence out there suggesting that psychiatric services within the community are actually very helpful. So the child has these problems, they get treatment, and it doesn't help them very much. So now, later on in life, they have problems again. Are they likely to go seek help? Are they likely to have any sort of kind of faith in this service system? Or are they likely to look for alternative ways to manage their symptoms? And one thing that substances do provide is that they do effectively provide temporary relief from distress and some sort of emotional problems. We know that they don't provide long-term relief. In fact, they can make these things worse. But on a temporary basis, they can kind of alleviate a person's struggles. And unfortunately, we kind of did this same analysis with childhood emotional disorders. We see kind of a trend toward the same finding in terms of increased risk for those that got services, having increased risk for substance disorders. It was most pronounced in this group that had a childhood behavioral disorder, okay, where we saw this really significant risk over here, okay? So, so this is kind of part of this grand challenge. There's a lot of kids that are affected by these problems. There's very few kids that are getting services. There's kids that are getting services. We don't have a lot of evidence that those services are very helpful for them. And some of those services actually might be making some of these things worse. And I am not overly convinced that our childhood mental health system is adequately addressing these problems at this point, okay? So I don't know how close I am to the end of my time. Do I have a few more minutes?
You have a few more minutes, indeed. Yes, Bill. Yeah.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, I'm going to then try to run through one more kind of set of findings here. And this is something that really became of interest to me when we did that work on cumulative prevalence. And we saw that very few kids got through to age 25 without having some sort of mental health problem. So the question became not what puts you at risk for mental health problems, but how do you actually avoid mental illness over those first 2.5 decades of life? So what happens to youth without a mental illness in adulthood? Remember, we'd kind of seen this pie chart at the beginning. We see how many kids are affected. We saw the other chart saying that even more are affected by age 25. And so what I wanted to do is to better understand who avoids childhood mental health problems. How are they different from the rest of us? And I came up with two hypotheses. You guys are smart. You can probably come up with more. But the two hypotheses I came up with were, one, that these kids had a very low risk liability. Okay. They had just, hit the lottery on a genetic level, maybe in terms of an environmental level, and they had not been exposed to risk factors, which would increase their risk for meeting criteria for a psychiatric disorder. I'm going to call that the lucky group, because it's through nothing of their own, volition that they've kind of gotten to that point. The other hypothesis is that there are kids that are high functioning despite having moderate to high risk liability. And from my reading of the literature, that is the very definition of resilience. Encountering an adversity and not having any sort of significant, problem in the wake of that adversity. So I sought out to see if there was evidence in Smokey to support either of these two hypotheses. Okay. I'm going to try to move through this pretty quickly here, but here are some risk exposures that we assess in Smokey. Yep. Sorry, did someone say something? Okay. Here are just a few of the risk exposures we look at in Smokey: low SES, unstable family structure, family dysfunction, family maltreatment, and peer maltreatment. And when we look at how associated these different types of risk are with having a disorder within childhood, we see exactly what you would expect, which is that each of these categories of risk is strongly associated with meeting criteria for a disorder. And the group that has the lowest, and it's that non-case group that has the lowest risk of exposure. But each of these categories were kind of strongly associated with this as well. And when you look at these things cumulatively, you say, okay, the person's not just kind of maltreated at home, but they're experiencing peer victimization at school. You see this kind of additive risk, okay? So for folks with none of these kind of risk factors, they have the lowest risk for childhood disorder. You can see that risk increases dramatically when they just have one or one of these risk factors. And then once we get to that 2 or more category, we can see that it's over 80% of the sample meets criteria for a well-specified disorder. It doesn't quite reach 100%, but it gets pretty darn close in this case, okay? The vast majority of those kids are meeting criteria for a disorder. So it's 84% of kids with 2 or more risk factors versus only 38% of those with 1 or fewer risk factors. Of course, this is a very significant association. We all know, and this is nothing new, that risk status is strongly associated with psychiatric problems. What was really interesting to me in this analysis is there is a group of kids in that upper right-hand corner, at least of my slide, that had 2 or more risk factors, but did not meet criteria for a childhood psychiatric disorder. It's about 7% of the sample, or about 100 kids that, that were no diagnosis despite all of this risk. And I kind of saw this group as really kind of my definition of what resilience would look like, not having a disorder despite this extraordinarily high level of risk. So I was very interested in learning more about this group that I call resilient and how they were able to kind of transition into adulthood. Were they able to kind of continue this string of resilience as they moved into adulthood? And that's what this table is showing right now. This figure is showing risk for different types of adult disorders. And there's 3 groups we're looking at here. The blue group is this group that were lucky, okay? They had low risk, they had no disorder, and they generally have the lowest rates of all of the adult disorder categories here, whether we're talking about emotional disorders or substance disorders. In the gray, we have the group that had a childhood disorder, and you can see that they generally have the highest risk for each of these. The orange bar is the interesting one, and that is this resilient group. They got through childhood, they took all the slings and arrows of childhood, and they got through it unscathed. So how did they do in adulthood? well, pretty good when it came to the substance disorders. You can see that for alcohol disorders, for cannabis disorders, and for illicit drug disorders, they look very similar to that group that is our low risk, no disorder group. Okay. Unfortunately, when it comes to our emotional disorder group, the depressive disorders and the anxiety disorder, they look more similar to the group that had a childhood diagnosis. So they seem to have evaded this risk for substance disorders, but now we can kind of see that they are seemingly a pretty high risk for depressive or anxiety disorders. So the resilience was real, but it was not, something that was persistent. It was not something that kind of lasted into adulthood for them. And when we look at these, functional, scales, we see this same sort of a mixed set of findings where they're definitely advantaged in some areas like social functioning and like risk for criminality, but definitely less so in terms of their financial, educational functioning and perhaps health as well. Okay. So as compared to non-cases, resilient children had higher symptom levels in childhood, greater risk for psychiatric problems in adulthood, and greater risk for critical outcomes in adulthood. So that's why the resilience really has a question mark next to it, because they were resilient in one domain, but not necessarily unscathed when we kind of followed them forward. And so I would kind of say that we have evidence that one way to avoid mental illness is it's really good to be lucky, but there isn't as much evidence to support this kind of resilient pathway. And I know I've got to be reaching my time limit here.
Yes, you are, and perhaps you can sum up now. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just going to kind of lay this out here. This is what I've been kind of going through. We kind of have this conundrum. Childhood disorders have an early onset. They're highly prevalent. We're not doing a very good job of treating these problems. There's not a lot of evidence that our services are necessarily helpful, and the outcomes are really significant. So really what I see as a grand challenge is that I feel like I said before, and the mental health community is failing to reduce the prevalence of disorders and failing to provide these children adequate help to help them avoid these problems. And those are the two things that I think should be the challenge for the next kind of generation of clinicians and researchers to kind of find the ways to kind of turn the tide and to do better than my generation has done in this regard. So with that, I'm going to stop and do want to kind of probably also thank the folks that started the study, the folks that have kind of continued the study and contributed to it over time. I absolutely want to thank the GSMS participants themselves who have allowed themselves to continue to be part of this for 30 plus years. Our wonderful data collection team, which has been there for 33 of the 33 years. This is how you keep a study going, is you keep the same people involved. And then obviously I also want to kind of thank NIH for being generous with their funding for this.
Dr. Copeland, thank you very, very much for an exciting, great seminar. Very, very interesting. For those who are not very much involved like me, highly exciting. Dr. Thiemeyer, Henning, would you have comments, or shall I open it overall for?
I think we should open it overall. Please do.
All right. Whom may I invite for a question or a comment?
Okay.
Seda Sternlund. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I had basically two questions. So this was a rural area. So what were the differences to more urban studies? Have you done any analysis on that? And then the second question was regarding the kids who received services and were not doing better. So I come from Finland, where healthcare is public, but mental health care services are limited. So the kids who have the highest severity conditions or more urgent conditions, they get service and the other ones don't. So I would think of these as well. The ones who have the most severe conditions, they get service, and that's why they show up worse later. So were you able to control for the severity in any way in those analyses?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I will say that that pattern of findings where we see increased risk in the group that got services was also shown in the TRAILS study as well, which is a European longitudinal study. So
Yeah.
it's not just kind of our sample necessarily. Um, but Sadie, we did our best, to kind of adjust for that severity thing. So we adjusted for their total number of emotional symptoms, their total number of behavioral symptoms, their total number of incapacities. We have a lot of information because of the study, and we were able to kind of, achieve an adequate covariant balance on all of those factors. But there's always the kind of potential for kind of unmeasured confounding with some of that. Excuse me. So I don't think that the story is that we're so far off that services actually are effective. But in terms of our actual estimates, there is absolutely could be some variability around kind of what we found in that regard. And then I'm forgetting the first question was about the rural effects.
Yeah, rural urban.
Okay, yeah. So there are some kind of differences in terms of the patterns and prevalences, for these things. I'm not as acquainted with differences in terms of the likelihood of getting service uses being all that more higher, within urban areas, but within the rural area, in some cases, our participants do have to travel a significant distance to get access to these services. Although I will say that this rural area was chosen because it was considered to have some of the best community mental health services in kind of the southeastern, kind of U.S. area. I will also say that kind of poverty kind of works a little bit different in the rural areas than in some of the urban samples that we've worked with, where it seems to be a little bit less predictive of mental health problems in the rural areas than it is in some of the other urban samples that we've kind of used. But there's probably a lot more to talk about there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have a question in the chat from Aaron Robin. Would you like to ask your question directly, please, Aaron?
Sure, I'll try. I'm operating from a handphone. Bill, that was wonderful. My question that I put in the chat is, there's so many benefits from such a long study, but one that strikes me is you can now start following up with the cohort's children. And I just wonder if there's been any efforts to look at risk and resilience sort of intergenerationally transmitted.
Yeah, absolutely, Aaron. Thank you for that question. So, yeah, this is kind of like a grand opportunity when the participants kind of get into their late 30s. You kind of realize that in our sample, 70% of them are now parents. Okay. And so we kind of immediately thought, okay, well, wouldn't it be really kind of interesting to be able to kind of get at those children of our participants at a similar age as our participants were when we began with them back in 1993. So we brought this idea to NICHD, and they were really actually excited about it. We actually paired it up with another longitudinal study that had participants that were about the same age. And so we've been funded, and we're currently in the process of collecting that intergenerational data. So kind of understanding the parenting behavior of our participants on their kind of children, understanding the children's exposure to different types of risk factor, and the children's kind of emotional and behavioral kind of mental health functioning too. What's interesting is that, obviously parents become, folks become parents at different ages. So we have a few grandkids of our original participants as well. There's some of our participants whose kids have now also had kids too. So more to come when it comes to that. Good question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Perhaps we are getting into injury time now. Any final question or comment? Then I thank you very, very much, Dr. Copeland, but I leave it to Dr. Thiemeyer to express our overall gratitude.
Well, what to say, Bill? Thank you very much. This was a very, I would say, very descriptive epi. There's also a lot of analytical epi ongoing in the cohort, but I want to emphasize that he is indeed open to collaboration. We have Johan, I think the student working with the data currently from my group is a participant. I saw him earlier. And I would like to say that we have a DUA in place at Harvard for this data. So that makes it easier to tag on research proposal of students if you want to wish. I know that he's so collaborative, so I say that without having talked to Bill about this before. I'm very happy he's nodding. I'll leave it there. So if people would like to collaborate, reach out to Bill or reach out to me. You might have to do with both of us, but you'll get access to the data. We have a good pipeline for that just in place. Admittedly, we worked on it for a year, but it's there now to be used. With that, I thank you all for joining, and see you soon.
Yeah. Thank you, Henning. Thank you, Bert. Thank you all.
Thank you very, very much. Yes.
Bye.
Thank
Take
you.
care.